In the year 2000, Francisco Labastida, the candidate for the Institutional Revolutionary Party, lost the elections in Mexico. This was an unexpected result at the time, as the PRI was known to tamper with elections in their 71-year reign, making them win every time. Them not tampering with the elections became Mexico's first real step as a democracy. A 71-year reign might seem small, compared to many other Latin American countries, which were a massive military coups and U-turning between democracy and dictatorship. Mexico's PRI lasted impressively long. But why did they last so long in power? And what made them give up power in 2000? The PRI was an odd one-party state. For example, they maintained the democratic principle of changing presidents every 6 years. Unlike other one-party states, you often get dictators once leaders solidify their power base. This oddity of changing presidents every 6 years gave the PRI the unique ability to change their policies pragmatically, as new leaders with new perspectives on governing the country appeared often. This is not the only explanation for the PRI's long reign though, as its long-lasting reign is tied to the party's origin in the Mexican Revolution. The PRI arose after a period of messy civil wars in Mexico called the Mexican Revolution from 1910 to 1920. The revolution started under the rule of Porfirio Diaz, who ruled from 1876 to 1910, but he oppressed the peasantry and jailed his opposition, so he was overthrown. His overthrower, Francisco I. Madero, was an idealist and he was a fierce believer in democracy and thus compromised with the conservatives to make them participate in democracy. This outraged his base of support, which wanted radical reform, the farmers and the workers. They saw Madero's compromise as a betrayal and started a rebellion with different leaders in different parts of the country. The conservatives, thinking that Madero's leadership was weak, supported a coup by Venustiano Huerta, who subsequently assassinated Madero. The revolutionaries, alarmed by the conservatives being back in power, quickly allied and won the subsequent civil war. With conservative political power shattered, the question now became how revolutionary the new government should be. Due to the many revolutionary leaders' differing ideologies, an attempt at a peaceful agreement failed. This started a new civil war, which was won by the more moderate constitutionalist faction. This left the country under the leadership of Venustiano Carranza, but he, like Madero before him, also dragged his feet on reform, slowly building up discontent. This discontent came to a head when he tried to make a political nobody his successor, which triggered a coup which ousted him. That coup's leader, Álvaro Obregón, became Mexico's new president and solidified his influence. This led to him maintaining his full term from 1920 to 1924, where moderate reform was pursued, pacifying the populace. However, issues arose when he chose his successor, Plutarco Elías Calles, which triggered a rebellion by a powerful general who desired the presidency for himself. After crushing the rebellion, Plutarco Elías Calles became president and continued the moderate reforms of his predecessor, but he also instituted more radical reforms, taking a particularly harsher stance on the clergy. In 1926, he instituted strict anti-clerical legislation, encouraging many people in Catholic provinces of Mexico to rebel, starting the Cristero War. His inability to stop the Cristero War, combined with his image of being a puppet of Obregón, weakened him politically. Thus, he had to make Obregón his party's candidate for the 1928 election, which Obregón won unopposed. However, Obregón was assassinated shortly after, and with Obregón dead, Calles had little opposition and made the PRI's predecessor, the Partido Nacional Revolucionario, to strengthen his grip on Mexico and stabilize the country after almost 2 decades of instability. The original name of the PRI was Partido Nacional Revolucionario. However, the PNR was not the same as his successor, because it primarily served as a mechanism for Calles to preserve his power, and therefore did not have the latter's flexibility. This is evidenced by the quick succession of 3 presidents who Calles controlled heavily. Other than peacefully ending the Cristero War, These three presidents did not have a significant lasting impact on Mexico due to their inability to diverge from Calles' vision. Nevertheless, some similar traits between the PRI and the PNR already began to show, such as electoral fraud. For example, in 1928, the PNR candidate Pascual Ortiz Rubio used electoral fraud to win the election. Calles' de facto rule over Mexico came to an end in 1935 due to Lázaro Cárdenas. Cárdenas, unlike the other presidents before him, managed to cultivate his own power base independently from Calles due to his radical reforms. This allowed him to resist Calles' control, eventually managing to exile him. Cárdenas also reformed the PNR, renaming it Partido de la Revolución Mexicana. Calles made the PRM have a corporate structure, giving influential interest groups an organization which would represent their interest within the party. This co-opting strategy would become integral to the future PRI's rule, as it would include opposing interest groups in the government, stabilizing Mexico. However, if an interest groups resisted co-option, the PRI brutally suppressed them. This carrot-and-stick strategy successfully co-opted many interest groups into the party organizations. The co-option of interest groups was perfect for the PRI, as they had a lot of control over the organizations, which made it possible to distort the desires of interest groups in their favor. Cárdenas also included the military as one of the interest groups, but this counterintuitively gave the civilian sector more control over the military. After Cárdenas' 6-year term ended, he refrained from controlling the next president, Manuel Avila Comancho, starting the tradition of the president giving up power when his term ended. This did not mean the presidents had no influence over Mexico's future when their term expired, though, as the PRM and PRI had a rule where the president unilaterally chose their successor, which was called El Dedazo. The Comancho presidency was characterized by the moderation of Cárdenas' policies, with détente with the Catholic Church being his main achievement. However, he was by no means a conservative, as he continued the land reforms of his predecessor. It was in the twilight years of Comancho's rule that the PRM was reformed into the PRI, with the main change being the military's complete subordination to the civilian sector. In the Mexican Revolution, the military had gained a lot of power, which several presidents slowly lowered to give the civilian sector more of it. In the end, the military was sufficiently weakened, allowing Comancho to completely kick the military out of the party without them violently resisting. The PRI originally started with a rightward shift, which was shown in Comancho's successor, Miguel Alemán Valdés. Alemán was very pro-business, abandoning some of the pro-worker policies of his predecessors. However, he was not right-wing like we would think of the word today, as he pushed for state-support industrialization instead of free-market industrialization. With his policies, Alemán created the Mexican economic miracle, which was a period of sustained economic growth for Mexico. Nevertheless, even with Mexico's booming economy, Alemán's popularity suffered due to several corruption scandals and growing inequality. To deal with these problems, Alemán's successor, Adolfo Ruiz Cortines, restarted some of the leftist policies of the original PRM and made the government more transparent, pacifying growing discontent with corruption and inequality. Cortines even prosecuted some of Alemán's associates to discourage corruption. These actions made Cortines immensely popular with the populace, and his tenure as president can be considered a golden age for PRI-popularity. Adolfo López Mateos, Cortines' successor, continued these reforms under pressure from the left within the party, also making him popular with the populace. Nevertheless, worker discontent still surfaced in the form of strikes, which were suppressed violently by Gustavo Díaz Ordaz, Mateos' enforcer, who became the next president. It was with the presidency of Gustavo Díaz Ordaz that things started to go downhill. The PRI had allowed corruption within its interest groups' organizations to placate party bureaucrats. This made the bureaucrats accept their lack of influence over the presidency, but corruption made them less able to represent their interest groups. Over time, the interest groups started to notice this contradiction between their desires and what the bureaucrats gave them, causing more frequent strikes. However, it is important not to overstate this issue. The bureaucrats were not completely incompetent and did represent their interest groups well in many situations. The real problem was that Ordaz reacted to the more frequent strikes with brutal crackdowns, culminating in the Tlatelolco massacre, where snipers killed hundreds of unarmed protesters. This act dealt a heavy blow to the people's trust in the government and the PRI, which Ordaz's successors were unable to truly fix. Following Ordaz's presidency, Echeverría ruled with the same iron fist as his predecessor, only lacking a crown jewel of oppression like the Tlatelolco massacre had been for Ordaz. Nevertheless, Echeverría did pursue leftist reforms, and the economy grew steadily under his presidency, which somewhat placated the public. However, that growth was mostly due to the aid of high oil prices, and Echeverría and his successor, José López Portillo, grossly mismanaged the economy. Portillo pursued democratic reforms during his tenure, but that was overshadowed by corruption scandals, making him unpopular. He also greatly increased Mexican reliance on oil, which triggered a massive crisis when oil prices fell. Miguel de la Madrid, the next president, resorted to privatization to solve the crisis, as the state-owned companies became even more inefficient under the complacent leadership of Echeverría and Portillo. He also prosecuted several of Portillo's associates to reduce corruption. Even after he did all those reforms, Mexico struggled with negative growth under de la Madrid's term. De la Madrid's reforms can be seen as the beginning of the PRI giving up its grip on society, as market liberalization reduced their control over the economy, which reduced the PRI's ability to co-opt opposition. Due to this increased pressure, the PRI started slow democratic reform to stabilize Mexico. Even with the start of these reforms, the next president, Carlos Salinas de Gortari, was elected under widespread accusations of electoral fraud, which had only become more frequent with the decline of the PRI. Salinas continued his predecessor's free market reforms and managed to stabilize the economy. However, economic mismanagement at the end of his term caused another economic crisis. After the pre-presidential candidate Colosio was assassinated, Ernesto Zedillo became his replacement. Things started to change under President Zedillo. Under the last few presidents, discontent with the PRI was mounting, which they reacted to by introducing slow democratic reforms, somewhat placating the opposition. Zedillo, unlike his predecessors, showed surprising enthusiasm for these democratic reforms. Under his tenure, the PRI's approval ratings slowly grew, as it became increasingly clear that the PRI was not going to engage in electoral fraud in the next election. It was in the year 2000 that the PRI candidate, Francisco Labastida, ended up losing the next election to the PAN candidate, Vicente Fox, ending the PRI's 71-year continuous rule. However, the PRI's acts of voluntarily giving up power dimmed the public's goodwill, which the PRI promptly utilized to win the 2012 presidential election under the leadership of Enrique Peña Nieto, after discontent with PAN rule grew. Nevertheless, old habits die hard, and Nieto's presidency was mired in corruption scandals, which thoroughly disillusioned the public with the PRI, making them lose the next election to the Morena party. Nowadays, under Morena party dominance, the PRI has become a shadow of its former powerful self. Its leader, Alejandro Moreno, has been accused of mismanagement and has alienated many within the party, weakening it. It is also widely regarded as the most corrupt party in Mexico. If nothing drastic changes, it seems that the party will slowly drift into obscurity. The PRI rose to power because of its unique style of authoritarian rule. While it was a quasi-dictatorship, it was able to respond to the desires of the populace with the different co-opted interest groups within the party, making them popular. This was strengthened due to the legacy of the Mexican Revolution, which gave the PRI the duty to defend the populace from exploitation. The PRI also maintained control over the economy and society, which made them apt to mediate between interest groups. Furthermore, the PRI's unique style of leadership selection, el dedazo, allowed it to be more pragmatic than other authoritarian states, because the presidency changed every 6 years, bringing in new perspectives when needed. All these things contributed to the Mexican government's stability under the PRI's rule. However, these things were also the reason for the PRI's downfall. To promote stability, they placated disgruntled bureaucrats by allowing corruption. This caused the bureaucrats to be less efficient at representing their interest groups over time, causing discontent. When the PRI encountered interest groups who would not willingly submit themselves, they crushed that interest group violently. This would incentivize joining the PRI to at least get somewhat represented, but it caused resentment. Under strong leadership, these issues could be smoothed out, but under the El Dedazo system, there was no feedback mechanism to discipline or impeach presidents, leaving many incompetent presidents in power. In the end, the PRI's flexibility also came back to bite them. When government enterprises began to falter under incompetence, the PRI began mass privatizations. That may have helped the economy, but it also weakened the PRI's control over society, making them worse mediators for conflicts between interest groups, reducing the PRI's importance. This was compounded by the legacy of the Mexican Revolution gradually becoming hazy, which made the PRI more authoritarian and exploitative to the people. When the authoritarian suppression tactics of Ordaz no longer dealt with discontent effectively, the PRI decided to democratize to preserve stability. However, this meant the people could choose other parties than the corrupt PRI, which they did. In the end, the PRI has now become a small party, a shadow of its former powerful self. In short, the PRI fell for many reasons, but the main one, in my opinion, is that they failed to mitigate the negatives of their unique style of authoritarian governance, especially corruption, eventually making them lose popular support.